gone Thursday and Friday.
Starts like the day before first meeting and comes back 2 days after. Anyway, so you know, I don't.
You've appointed your emergency alternate, I assume.
Yeah, right.
But do we still have it? Remember that?
Vaguely, but
There was something like that. I do recall that. Yeah. Emergency, but that was like if you were incapacitated.
I think so.
Yeah, I could bring my dog in. He could sit here on the chair and bark yes or no.
Yeah, what's a good-looking dog?
Yeah. Tenants unit forming in Albany. Ooh.
See how much your steak is. Eat a little salad before
is there anything I can do to help?
I think I figured it out.
I can go sit down there. I can go sit down there.
Only if I really get mad at you.
That would be sad.
Past time. All right. I'll call to order the City Council meeting of Tuesday, January 21st. And the first order of business will be the Pledge of Allegiance, which I will recite. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And will the clerk please do the roll call?
Here. Here.
Here. Here.
Here. Next order of business is a ceremonial matter. I would like to present a certificate of appreciation to Councilmember Nason for her service as mayor during the past year. Will you join me at the podium?
Sure.
Unfortunately, I do not have a bunch of whereas clauses to read, but I can personally ad-lib that I thank you very much for your service to the city during the past year, and I appreciate your leadership, and I keep in mind your leadership while I try to do my best to lead the city as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's been a privilege to serve. Thank you.
Was there a member of the public who wanted to speak on that item? If not, then I'll move on to the next item, which is report of action taken in closed session. There was no closed session, so we'll move on to consent calendar. Consent calendar are items considered to be routine by the City Council and will be enacted by one motion. By approval of the consent calendar, the staff recommendations will be adopted unless otherwise modified by the City Council. There'll be no separate discussion on these items unless a council member or a member of the audience requests removal of the items from the consent calendar. I will go ahead and remove item 5.9. Are there any other council members who wish to remove an item?
5.5.
5.5, 5.5 and 5.9. A member of the public wishing to remove an item?
5.7.
5.7. So we have 5, 7, and 9. Any other removals of items? All right, let's go in numerical order. And item 5.5.
I just need to recuse myself from voting on this item as a member of the Albany Community Foundation, so I'd like to have it voted on as a separate item.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Maris, would you like to speak on item 5.7?
Alan Maris, Albany resident. I'm really pleased to see that we're going after the funding for our affordable housing project with our SAHA consultant, Satellite Affordable Housing. Anything we can do to put as much money into this project as possible to get the greatest number of very low-income units to be available to members in our community who have no housing. I think this effort is certainly admirable and necessary. I have one question now, which I may ask again later, but I'm just wondering what other possible sources of funding there are for our affordable housing project, and if SB 50 provides the funding for the affordable housing requirements that it's placing on local governments.
Thank you. Any other public comment or council comment on items 5.5 or 5.7? Moving on to item 5.9. One moment while I pull up my notes on this one. I'm, one moment, sorry. Should have been ready for this. Okay, well, I'll do my best to remember my comments. I think I had two comments about this item, and I was caught a little unawares about this item. I think just for my lack of noticing it the last time, that our direction about doing a specific plan to staff is going to occur in two phases. The first phase will not include the actual specific plan, but will include the research in preparation for doing a specific plan, and the specific plan is phase 2. The first phase is not covered by the current contract in front of us. So I was caught by the fact that the contract explicitly says it does not include a specific plan, but that was the intention, and that was presented to us in an earlier council meeting as well. I missed it, and I just wanted to make sure to call that to the council members to their attention as well. The second thing I noted, which is not a big deal, is that the contract notes that comparisons will be done with other jurisdictions, and it mentions jurisdictions that are kind of far-flung from us, rather than El Cerrito and Berkeley, which are our neighbors. And my suggestion was that we consider our closest neighbors when we do that research, as well as perhaps other far-flung places where it might be more appropriate, where there are denser cities doing denser development. But I think that is a minor point that certainly will be, that detail will be worked out as we go through the contract. So I think those were my only points. Anyone else want to speak to this item? And my lips are not working that well today. Any member of the public wish to speak on this item? Seeing none, I recall that the council member, the vice mayor, would like to be recused from item 5.5. So do we have a motion to move the consent calendar minus item 5.5?
I move the consent calendar minus 5.5.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Will you do the roll call, please?
Councilmember Barnes?
Yes.
Councilmember Moss?
Yes.
Councilmember Nason?
Yes.
Vice Mayor McQuaid recused, and...
No,
No,
she's
this is the one I'm
in on this.
voting on.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. Yes.
And Mayor Pilch.
Yes. And a motion for 5-5.
So moved.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Roll call, please.
Councilmember Barnes?
Yes.
Councilmember Moss?
Yes.
Councilmember Nason?
Yes.
This one, Vice Mayor recused, and Mayor Pilch.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Okay. Thank you very much. Moving on from the consent calendar, we have the good of city public comment. For any persons wishing to address the city council on an item that is not on the agenda, please note that city policy limits each speaker up to 3 minutes. I may reduce the time limit per speaker depending on the number of speakers. The Brown Act limits the council's ability to take and/or discuss items that are not on the agenda. Therefore, such items are normally referred to staff for comment or to a future agenda. Is there anyone who wants to speak to an item not on the agenda? Please.
Okay.
If
Listen, I cannot stand there.
understood, but I think we have a microphone that we can give to you.
I'll start when I get to my, yeah. Thank you so much. And I don't know how to operate it. So there's- okay. All right, my name is Leah. I'm a former resident of this wonderful city, Albany. I currently am in affordable housing, a Saha property in Berkeley. My heart and soul and spirit is in Albany. I would love to come back and live here as soon as I can. I wanted to talk very briefly about the the cost of homelessness. I was living in my van for 4 years and could not deal with my health or anything in my life except sheer survival. I was finally housed in August, and my health crashed. I fell down in my apartment twice. I was in what is known as ketoacidosis, blood sugar 519. I went to the ER and into the ICU and spent a week at Alta Bates for the tune of about $125,000, and then another 5 weeks in a nursing home facility for another $15,000 or $20,000. I just got released as an inmate from one of those places last week. I wanted to say that the price that I paid for being homeless is astronomical. I had to withdraw from graduate school. I can no longer drive. I can barely walk. The pain in my hands and feet from nerve damage is off the charts. I am miserable all the time. I do not see what kind of future I will have, and this is after Phi Beta Kappa graduation from UC Berkeley 3 years ago. I thought I had a future. I don't see that now. This is a direct result of being homeless. The cost to our communities, to our society of lost human potential is enormous. People living under the bridge in those tarps, in those cars, in those vans, on the verge of homelessness, they have something to contribute to our communities. I am no longer sure if I can contribute anything anymore, but trying to get through another day and survive another day, trying to manage my blood sugar, trying to hope that this is done, not irreversible damage, but something where I can learn and grow from it, make good of it. So I'm in support of anything that this community can do towards the end of helping homeless people and poor people live the best lives they know how to live. Had I had support during those 4 years of living in my van, you can't seek medical care when you're homeless. There's a whole pile of things you just don't do because you're surviving. If I had gotten the help, and moreover, if I had not been homeless, my diabetes would not be the disaster it is. I wouldn't have spent all that time at Alta Bates and the nursing home. That $150,000 could have gone a long way to house people instead of giving it to the medical industrial complex. So I wanted to say to you guys, I am back. I am in a lot of pain. I don't know what my life brings, but I mean to do something with what I have learned to helping this community. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your comments, and I'm very sorry to hear your story. Any other speakers who go to the city, please, Mr. Maris.
Albany resident, Alan Maris. I think one of the big strengths of our community are our schools. I think we bring great families into the community because of our schools, and our schools are in need of funding. It costs money to run a good school. And there is going to be a Measure B on the ballot, March 3rd, I believe it is, early March anyway, when we're all voting on primary candidates as well.
March 3rd.
Please vote yes on Measure B to support our wonderful schools. Thanks.
Thank you. Any other members of the public? I'll take this opportunity to read a mayor's statement that I prepared, and I'm almost found it. The Ninth Circuit has now ruled regarding the cross on Albany Hill, and the council's discussion continues on this matter. While we are disappointed in this ruling, we remain committed to seeking out our options regarding the removal of the cross from public land. I want to reiterate to everyone here and to the public that neither the City Council nor the City of Albany endorses in any way the lighting of the cross for any occasion, religious or nationalistic, or supports its continued presence on public property. We have given direction to staff to place signage near the cross stating the same. We appreciate the input and support received to date from the public, and we encourage you to continue to respectfully share your concerns over this religious symbol on public land with the Lions Club as well as this City Council. And if there's no further good of the city, we'll move on to council subcommittee reports, member reports and appointed representation, and other meetings and events. Are there any subcommittees reporting today?
I have a question. Are we going to, I would like to withdraw from a couple of these subcommittees. Are we going to talk about the subcommittees, their personnel?
Okay, so can you perhaps bring that up as a on the future agenda item?
Will do.
That would be great. Seeing no subcommittees reporting?
Well, didn't we meet since,
I guess we did. I did make a note that we, Councilmember Moss and I are the Youth Engagement Subcommittee, and we are continuing to work with the Y. We're planning to provide a local government module for the Youth in Government program, and it'll be, I believe, early in March.
Okay, thank you for that. Any others? Seeing none, Councilmember Barnes, do you have any appointed representation to report on? Councilmember Moss.
no.
Vice Mayor McQuaid.
I'll just mention 3 things that I attended. I don't have formal reports, as there was nothing really that bubbled up to that level. I did attend the Housing Authority, and I will say that I'm on the committee to interview the new executive director, so we'll be working on that in the next couple of months. With the mayor, I also attended the 2x2x2 with UC and school district, and with the also attended the mayor's conference with the assistant city manager.
Thank you. Councilmember Nason.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it would be interesting to hear about the 2x2.
It would be, and I was hoping that the Vice Mayor would report more substantially on that. We did talk about Measure B, was one of the items, but I cannot, and the school construction update was another item we discussed. And as the city manager wish to report?
No, I would just say those are the 2 main things. We talked a little bit about disaster preparedness as it reflects on all of us. As far as construction, we did have a brief discussion about the basketball courts that were at Memorial Park and how that situation can be resolved.
And
Joe
to
Payne?
add, we also discussed the census and outreach to encourage activity in the census.
That's right. The county has a page. They're directing efforts in the county for the census. There's also the federal efforts, but we made note of the fact that it's very important that the census be conducted completely, that we count everyone, because our funding in the county, in the area, depends on it. So if you can consider volunteering or even working for the census, please go to the county's census website.
Was there a report from the Safe Routes to School Task Force at all?
No, not on this one. And any other reports from council members? Remember, we're reporting since December 16th meeting, although there wasn't very much else in December.
Do you want just regular things we did, or are we on?
I'll report on my appointed meetings, and then we can go to the other things. I attended the EBCE meeting and attended most of that, although I had to leave a little bit early. I think the important thing to note about that is that PG&E is offering to East Bay Community Energy power from their one nuclear facility, Diablo Canyon. And they're offering it for no cost. But of course, it comes with the baggage of being power from a nuclear source. And that is something that I probably will bring back as an agenda item for this council to talk about, since it's a very heated item in some circles. The debate is, well, it's free, but of course it comes from nuclear. So and many people have an opinion about that. So I don't believe that's coming back to the Community Energy Board meeting until a few months from now. I also attended the Waste Management Board in December and the Programs and Administration Committee meeting in January of the Waste Management Board. The one thing that came up there, which will be on the agenda for this week, is the ban on single-use items. The county is, as the former Mayor Nason brought before us, the county is considering whether they want to do some sort of ballot measure or some sort of initiative, ordinance about that, or whether they want to totally leave it to cities. And that is up for discussion, but no decision, I believe, this week. Finally, I attended the ACTC projects and programs meetings. Nothing substantial to report there. And I'll just, if there's nothing other to report on appointed items, I'll just go ahead and mention my other meetings attended and then go by the other council members. I attended a tour with an environmental group of the Howard Terminal, where the A's hope to locate their ballpark. I attended a press conference with Vice Mayor McQuaid from the elected officials to protect California, hosted by the elected officials to protect California at the Alameda City Council steps. I attended the Women's Day March. I attended a film screening in El Cerrito on Sunday of Jim Crow of the North, and the community leaders meeting this morning, and also the wonderful celebration of Martin Luther King Jr. in Piedmont on Monday. Which I got an invitation for this year. I don't know if I was the only one of the other council members who got an invitation, but it was a wonderful event. I highly recommend it, and apparently it's been going on for 23 or 26 years in Piedmont every Martin Luther King Day. So very impressive that they've been doing that. Councilmember Barnes, any other meetings to report? Councilmember Moss.
None that I can recall.
Okay. Vice Mayor McQuaid.
I participated in a Climate Mayor's conference call, the art of opening at the community center. Again, there's a wonderful show over there if you haven't seen it yet. As the mayor mentioned, I hosted my community leaders meeting this morning. One of the really fun things that sometimes we get to do is to give residents special recognition. So I attended a celebration for one of the senior center people who was turning 100 and got to give him a certificate. And as the mayor said, the press conference in Alameda.
Councilmember Nason.
Yes, I've been to a number of meetings in connection with the East Bay Regional Park District and its Park Advisory Commission. And for the matter that would be of interest to the council, I think, is that Elizabeth Eccles is now our appointee to the replacing the recently deceased Whitney Dotson on the East Bay Regional Park District Board. And I'm in communication with Ms. Eccles about meeting with our bulb subcommittee and eventually with our council.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, moving on then, past the meeting reports, we come to the, there's item 7.3 is strangely blank. Is that an error? It's the city council meetings and events, or is that meant to have been past events or?
That's what we just did.
Oh, okay, that's the item we just did. Thank you. Still getting used to this. And now for the city manager report.
Thank you, Mayor. I am going to use the graphics from our e-news. If anyone here or watching hasn't signed up for our e-news, please do. It informs you of all that's happening in Albany with a lot of links to more information. The first thing I'd like to report and acknowledge is the Cordonices Creek cleanup. It was a coordinated effort. Can't read that screen that far away, so let me go to my notes here. With Friends of Five Creeks and the Friends of Albany Parks. We had a great turnout at this event and planted a lot of native plants and really did great work on the creek together in recognition of making it a day of service. Also, in the e-news is something that I'm really proud of. Our Public Works Department took the time to summarize their year in review. And if you haven't seen this, please take some time to look at all these great projects that we have accomplished. I know there's a lot of things when you look around town that you wish could also be improved, and we're working on it. But you can see here from the number of bullets of accomplishments, there's been a significant improvement throughout the city, and we're continuing through sidewalk improvements, road rehab, and a lot more to come over the next year. So I applaud that department for really leading the charge. Also, we have a number of sustainability workshops coming up. This is stemming off the council's adoption of our climate action plan. We're really hitting the ground running with a lot of different avenues in terms of how we can be a greener community. All the way from carbon awareness, electrical vehicles, and also back to the basics with recycling. What actually goes in our recycling? It's changed over the last handful of years, and it's always great to have a refresher. For example, plastic bags don't go in the recycling, and that's something that's a hard lesson for some. So again, take advantage of those hands-on courses. Next, it's all right in a line here for me. The security camera registration program is off to a great start. We already have 14 residents who have signed up voluntarily for this program. What it is that they have security cameras at their homes, and they are coordinating with our police department just for an extra eye out and about in the community. And those 14 signups are in less than a month. So definitely find out more. It's an opportunity to keep your community safe. Our CERT program is always well attended. Signups are now available. So again, please take advantage. This is a disaster preparedness course, and you get to graduate and get applauded by our council. And let's see, a couple things not on the list here. Oh yes, the Be Curious is going to be a very interesting event coming up, all about bees. So again, take advantage of this new endeavor at our community center. Learn more about bees. And, oh, and heavens, I forget. We have a water bottle filling station here in City Hall. It's down the hall next to the restrooms. I'm very proud of it. It went in over the weekend. So take a look. It has it counts how many bottles you've saved over time. So
Fantastic.
we're proud of our new filler. Thanks, that's it.
Great. Yeah. I recall the words when we had coverage in Patch. I recall the words of the reporter, can't remember her name now. Emily, yes.
So,
She said once reporting on Albany, slow down, Albany. You've got too much going on. So thank you for that report. Looks like that city manager is done with her presentation. Next, we have item 9, which is a presentation on Senate Bill 50 by Senator Scott Wiener. And if approved, will amend state laws substantially impacting local planning and zoning regulations in residential zoning districts. The staff recommendation is that we authorize myself to prepare a letter regarding the legislation, whether we are pro or con. And may I ask staff where this information came from?
I believe the document you're holding came from Councilmember Barnes.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, thank you for that. And I believe Councilmember Moss also provided some information.
It's in the packet.
And which is in the packet. So does staff have more to report? Thank you, Jeff. Please go ahead.
Yes, good evening. Thank you, Mayor and council members. What I'd like to do is summarize for you Senate Bill 50. It's a complicated piece of legislation. I'll do my best to answer your questions, but in some cases, the answers to some of your questions are probably not clear. It's very much a work in progress. I'd also like to start out by noting some of the positive things about the bill. I have some concerns and some complexities that I'll be highlighting, but to start out with, there are some good things about SB 50. And I think most importantly, it is trying to create higher density housing near transit and near job centers. And I think there's generally a consensus in the urban planning world that that's what we need in order to make our transportation system work more efficiently, reduce greenhouse gases, and make our housing more affordable. So it's trying to do the right things. And I don't think particularly in Albany, but in many communities, the time and cost associated with government approval processes for housing projects are a real issue. And so the legislation, again, is maybe in kind of an awkward way, but is trying to address an issue that is something that is a problem in some communities. To summarize, there are two main elements of this legislation that could have an effect in Albany, and I'll go through each of these in a little bit more detail. The first is the provisions for a neighborhood multifamily project. And this would, in limited circumstances, allow 4-unit residential structures in including in single-family residential districts. I'll go into a little bit more detail on that in a moment. And the legislation also introduces something called the Equitable Communities Initiative, which in 2023 would require cities to approve essentially qualified projects in specific what are characterized as job-rich or transit-rich areas. And again, I'm going to go into a little bit of detail about each of these terms. First, the neighborhood multifamily project concept that's in the legislation. It would allow either a vacant lot be developed with 4 units or an existing building be remodeled to accommodate 4 units. In addition, it would limit the parking requirements that the city could impose and would limit the types of standards that we could apply to objective standards that are essentially predetermined. And it also requires a ministerial approval process, which means there's no public notice, no public hearings. I will, at the end of the presentation, kind of highlight what I think the potential impacts for the legislation is in Albany. This is not a provision that I think is going to get a lot of utilization in Albany. There might be, we have just a handful of vacant lots, and most of the existing residential structures in town just are too small to accommodate 4 units cost effectively.
Jeff, sorry, quick question. does this standard apply only to counties with more than 600,000 people or to both?
No, I believe this applies to,
All counties?
I believe so. I'll double check that. It's a good question because the legislation is not.
Yeah, I was there in the committee hearing when they did that
Okay.
dividing line. I can explain later.
The Equitable Communities Initiative, again, this is a portion of the legislation which if a community has a job, is designated as a job-rich area or as a transit-rich area, a developer can apply for exceptions to some of the all of the primary land use controls, including the density, the parking, height restrictions, and floor area ratios, and also, again, requires ministerial approval of applications that comply with the terms of the legislation and comply with our objective standards.
Jeff, what do they mean by job rich?
I thought it was the next slide. It's one slide after this. I'll get to that. So to comply with this, it's not completely a blank check. The developers do need to meet the affordable housing requirements that are in the legislation. They do have to, as I mentioned, have to comply with the objective standards that the city would need to adopt. And there are protections in the legislation so that this isn't used to work around city requirements for affordable housing or organized labor protections.
Sorry, so would that mean if the city has more as a requirement for more affordable housing than the legislation requires, the city's
example, yes.
still wins out? Okay.
To Vice Mayor McQuaid's question, job rich, one of the criticisms, legitimate criticisms of this legislation as it stands today is nobody knows what a job rich area is or where a job rich area might be. The legislation basically identifies it as areas that are, quote, high opportunity, which means for the residents that live there, there are positive educational and economic outcomes for the most part. There are also areas where there are more jobs than typical for the region and areas that have shorter commutes relative to existing commuting patterns in the region. The State Housing and Community Development Department would be required to produce these maps, but we wouldn't know what those maps say until the beginning of next year, probably at the earliest. So it's impossible to know whether Albany would qualify as job rich or not. The second category is transit rich, and this is a little bit better defined. These are defined either as areas that are within a half a mile of a rail station, such as BART in our case, or a quarter of a mile radius of a stop on a high-quality bus corridor. And on the screen is the definition of a high-quality bus corridor. Almost certainly the 72 stops, or the 72 stop at Solano and San Pablo would be considered a high-quality stop because it serves both the 72, the 72M, and the 72R, and the volumes appear to meet, the current volumes at least, of bus service meet these criteria. So in other words, a graphic here, this is a kind of a rough representation of what the quarter mile and half mile areas would be. The top of the screen, we get a little piece of the half mile radius from the El Cerrito BART station. The bus stop at Solano and San Pablo all that will be within Albany. And then we get a little slice of the 72R stop at Gilman and San Pablo on the south side of the city. Again, these are kind of crude measurements for what a quarter of a mile and a half mile represent, but it gives you the general idea of what we're talking about as transit-rich area. So this legislation has been very controversial, as I think Council is aware. Most recently, early this month, the author, Senator Scott Wiener, introduced an amendment to the legislation offering the cities an option to create a local flexibility plan as an alternative to simply accepting the state standards as written in the legislation. I think there's some concerned about what this really involves and whether this is really giving cities any additional flexibility or not. What the legislation says is that, first of all, this local flexibility plan, whatever it might end up being, needs to be completed by 2023, which is an issue I can get to in a moment. We have to meet the same housing capacity as we would have with the state legislation as it is drafted. Also have to further meet fair housing requirements. This is non-discrimination types of requirements. Have to demonstrate greater transportation efficiency. And then finally, the local flexibility plan would be subject to state review and approval. So while it might be a useful tool to be able to fine-tune where we would want some of the higher density housing, it's hard to know whether we have much flexibility, and we wouldn't know until the state prepares guidelines on how to prepare these plans, which won't happen until after the legislation is approved.
Can you explain what must demonstrate greater transportation efficiency? Greater than what?
That's one of the questions that is not clearly laid out in the legislation that I can't answer very well.
Okay.
My guess is what they're trying to get at is the idea of putting the higher density housing close to transit stops is they don't want us to move the higher density housing further away from a transit stop, which would possibly encourage people to, instead of taking the bus, they just drive. I think that's what they were getting at, but again, I'm reading into that a little bit.
No, not quite yet, but we will.
A couple of things I'll just go through quickly. There is a provision for sensitive communities. These are communities that tend to meet various criteria that Albany probably will not meet in terms of income and environmental conditions and so forth. In those communities, they will have a different process where they can create a community plan. Again, I'm pretty confident that that's not going to apply to Albany. There are also some exceptions to SB 50. Again, none of these I think will apply to Albany. As I mentioned, the sensitive communities. In addition, there's a provision that I think was just a simple political compromise that for smaller cities, less than 50,000 people, in smaller counties, less than 600,000, they have a little bit different criteria of requirements for contained in SB 50. It also exempts smaller cities and coastal zones where, for environmental reasons, high-density housing development may not be desirable, high fire hazards, and then the final bullet point might be applicable in some cases here in Albany if you can't use these provisions if you're developing a site that already contains rental housing or is a historic resource. So there's a lot going on in the legislative, and has been a lot going on in the legislative world over the last few years, and SB 50 adds to that. It is not necessarily integrated very well yet, it doesn't appear to be, but we do have density bonus laws that allow developers to request exceptions to different requirements, and those are pretty standard now. There are also some big changes coming in housing element law. SB 35 is legislation that was approved a couple years ago that expedites approval of affordable housing requirement projects. And SB 330, which is a new piece of legislation that became effective at the beginning of the month, adds new procedural protections for housing development applications and also prohibits cities from downzoning residential properties. So SB 50 kind of fits into the changing world of land use planning in California. So the next couple of slides, I just want to highlight some of the issues that I think this legislation produces. Again, do want to acknowledge that there are some important things that it's trying to accomplish, but it doesn't do it in a very clear way, in my view. First, it really undermines some of the state mandated plans that we have to do. So things like housing elements and general plans and even zoning ordinances that we're required to develop and maintain, and we spend hundreds of thousands of dollars working on that over every few years. And this bill would essentially blow up whatever was in those plans, and they wouldn't be very applicable. With respect to ministerial permits, the big thing that in this community is really important is public notice. People participate in public hearings. They are used to hearing about what's going on in their neighborhood, and this legislation would exempt a lot of projects from public notice. It also allows developers to pay fees in lieu of actual development of affordable housing, which is something that for cities like Albany that are under a lot of pressure to actually create on the ground affordable housing, acceptance of a fee in lieu of actual development would be a concern, I would think. And then finally, not every project that comes in the door is a well-designed project, and these objective design standards limit our ability to work with applicants to make their projects work better and look better.
Jeff, I want to clarify, SB 50 only allows objective standards that were in place on January 1, 2019, right? But no more subjective aesthetic standards.
For the projects that qualify, yes, that's correct.
Okay.
A couple of other things to point out. SB 50 it addresses one issue, but the real issue these days is the cost of actually building housing, the cost of land, the cost of construction, financing, and so forth. Irrespective of all this other stuff that's in SB 50, it's still very difficult to build housing at a cost that people can afford to live in. It also relies heavily on the concept of using transit service, and it doesn't make any assurances that transit service will actually be available to serve people in the community where the new housing would be going in. And then finally, I mentioned the local flexibility plan. One of the issues with that is the timing of preparing that local flexibility plan would conflict with the time that we need in order to prepare a new housing element. And the ability to do both of those at the same time, at least here in Albany, is just not practical to take on two major planning efforts like that at the same time. So finally, this is my last slide, and then be happy to take any other questions and comments. As I mentioned, I don't expect a high volume of the neighborhood multifamily project applications. And I think in large part because the value of our single family homes is so high, the economic incentive for an investor is to build or renovate a single family home and sell it, and not go through the more complex process of converting a single family home into a multifamily structure. And then, as I mentioned, we have a bunch of other laws already on the books. So the Equitable Communities Initiative, in many respects, is a duplication of those other laws. And I don't expect that this new legislation, if it were to pass, would suddenly open up a floodgate of new development sites that we aren't already expecting to have happen. So it may change the process that we go through for some of these developments along San Pablo Avenue, but I wouldn't expect it to increase the number of development projects that we see. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Okay. Councilmember Barnes, let's start with you. I meant Councilmember Moss, sorry. I'm trying to do a little rotation of the comments. Let's limit ourselves to questions at this
Are we doing
point.
comments or questions?
Just questions at this point, because I want to open it to the public as soon as we can.
Yeah, I mostly have comments at this point. It seems, I think that's a great presentation that you did, without getting into a question here, but a lot of things seem very unsettled, as you put it. So I'm not sure if, what we might be doing tonight on something that we don't even know what it is quite yet, or what comments we might be making.
Okay.
But,
no questions.
Yeah.
Okay. Vice Mayor?
Well, I think my only question is probably unanswerable, but as you stated, it seems like this flexibility plan kind of bumps into the housing element plan, and that would be difficult. Is there any thought maybe in Sacramento or corresponding legislation that's going to change how we do housing elements? Have you heard anything from that side?
There is already chaptered into law significant legislation that's going to make it much more difficult for cities like Albany to do our housing element.
But there's no thought of removing it and replacing with this local flexibility plan?
I haven't heard anything about that, but I don't have my ear to the ground in Sacramento, so you folks may be better in tune with that politically than I am.
Okay, well, I'm going there on Thursday. I'll try to check it out. And my other question is there a companion transit bill? I mean, they talked about increased transit and making transit better, but if there's not a sort of a companion bill, it seems a little wishful.
I'm not aware of a
What's the question?
companion bill. I do think in the Plan Bay Area 2050 process, which is in some respects another agenda item, but I do think there is an effort to focus transit investment in the Bay Area in places where housing's going in, but I don't know that that's embedded in legislation. I think that's just a programmatic effort by the Metropolitan Transportation Commission.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Nason.
No questions.
No questions. Questions, Councilmember Barnes?
Yeah, I have a few. I notice here on the bill about the multifamily, quadplexes stuff, it's actually in the front. It says streamline ministerial process approval within 60 days of submission. Given how busy you are, is doing all this within 60 days for every project?
Is that a question?
Is it realistic? 60 days?
I think we can do it in 60 days, actually. It means that we have to be much more disciplined in managing our time, and we won't have as much flexibility to respond to unanticipated opportunities or issues because we've got a clock running on something else.
And the other question, it's kind of the same question, but at the HCD level, remember in 2017, there was that 15 bill package that passed. Then there was 200 bills proposed last year. And this bill, if it passes, is murky enough with about HCD's role that I imagine they're going to be pretty busy just trying to figure this out. Are you getting any sense in dealing with HCD that they're feeling the stress of all the extra workload being put on them?
I haven't talked to anyone at HCD about that specifically, but I can tell you they're hiring a lot of people. They're actively out there recruiting dozens of positions. I get an email, every planner in the state gets an email a week with 6 new openings or 8 new openings at HCD. They're a growing bureaucracy.
All right, last question. It is my understanding, I just want to confirm this with you, that if a project has 10 units or less, there's no affordability requirement at all.
I believe that was the threshold number. I think you're right.
For example, these quadplexes would not have any affordability requirements. Most infill projects would be 10 units or less, and they would have no affordability requirements.
Well, we have our own inclusionary requirements of 15%, so anything over 7 units requires a local inclusionary unit.
And we get to keep that.
That's right.
And Councilmember Moss, you have...
Yeah, I probably misunderstood it when I read it, but I thought that there was something that triggered off this idea that you would allow fourplexes. In other words, if we didn't show the ability to produce the amount of housing they're looking for, then people would be able to go to the fourplex idea? Or is that just going to be automatic automatically allowed?
It's my reading of the legislation that's automatic.
It is automatic.
And beginning of, if signed this year, but beginning in 2021.
Okay.
I will point out that right now on the books, you can build in a single-family residential district in Albany, you can have your primary home and 2 ADUs.
Right.
So that's on the books, and that's, I don't know that we've got an application for 2 ADUs yet, but we probably will.
They still have to meet the FAR. Or?
There's been some significant changes in state law about ADUs. You'll be seeing a new ordinance coming through here very shortly. We're working on crafting a new requirement, and there are some changes to our development standards because of new state laws.
2 questions for me. One is can you Just briefly, I want to ask about inclusionary zoning and density bonus. So you say we already have our own inclusionary zoning. Briefly, can you tell me what the numbers are for that?
15% of the units need to be affordable. Half of the 15% are to very low income and half to moderate income.
And that's for any project of what size?
More than 7. So once the 15% rounds up to 1,
I see.
then
Okay.
an inclusionary unit is required.
Okay. And then density bonus, forgive my ignorance, but is that something that's come down from the state, or do we have density bonus ordinance as well?
We have, it's state legislation that mandates cities adopt density bonus provisions. And it essentially, if you meet the criteria in state law, you can get waivers and concessions to different types of city zoning requirements depending on the amount of affordable housing that you're providing.
Okay, so it may override local city zoning if the
It already
criteria are met.
is. And that's been on the books in various forms. It's evolved, but it's been a part of state law for probably 10, 15 years at least.
Okay, and lastly, you mentioned that there are things coming down that will make doing housing elements even more difficult. Can you briefly summarize what that is about?
Yes, there's two things that are going to kind of collide together. The first is the state is probably going to require that the Bay Area region produce a plan for a significant increase in the number of housing units. Using Southern California as an example, the state increased their target, I don't remember the raw numbers, but basically tripled it from the last planning process to the current planning process.
This is the RENA numbers?
These are the RENA, the Regional Housing Needs Assessment numbers.
Okay.
So they in the Southern California is tripled. I think the consensus of thought in the Bay Area is that ours are going to at least be doubled. The second thing, and again, this is established law now, that cities will be limited in our ability to count sites that are non-vacant and sites that have been used in previous housing elements and not developed. Essentially not letting, the term that's used, we're not allowed to recycle sites. If it's not being developed or there's some economic use, even if it's not particularly high value economic use, it will be more challenging to be able to use those sites. And that's going to hit us hard because a lot of our development sites in our current housing element are along San Pablo Avenue.
Okay, interesting. All right, if there's no further questions from the council, I'd definitely like to open up to the public. Can I get a sense for how many people are here to speak on this item? Okay, not too many. Please go ahead and approach the podium.
Should we start with the speaker cards?
Sure, yeah. We have a couple of speaker cards, so let's start with those.
Alan Maris and Aaron Pruvin.
Hi, Alan Maris, Albany resident. Thank you for your service to the community. It really is daunting, and I think you do a great job.
Thank you.
I guess my main concerns about this are that the developers have a little too much control over the rules and the results of the low-income housing that's being produced. We have to be really careful about that. So much housing has come in for the moderate and above, and so little comes to the really people who really need it. So, and I'm not seeing in this legislation that they really address that. I think the numbers are very low for meeting the needs of very low-income housing. I think there's something around 15% inclusionary that you talked about already. In Albany's housing element, about half of the housing needs are for very low and low-income people, and we're not seeing this requirement in SB 50. At least I'm not. And I did try to get through the legislation. It's a little tough to read with all the redacts, but also I am encouraged to see that we have some opportunity for local control. What do we call it? The local flexibility plan. And I am hopeful that our project with Saha is an example of effective local flexibility, local flexibility, community planning. I think we have the potential for having well over 15% for very, very low income families. And I'd hate to see our project jeopardized by anything the state comes down with. The state tends to, I think, come in with a big hammer. And oftentimes they're mandated, unfunded state regulations that really hurt local communities. We've seen it in the school districts. We've seen it in our local community as well. So I am sympathetic with the League of Cities' skepticism about this bill. The housing needs are there. It's an incredible need. The people living on the streets, we can't put up with that anymore. We need housing for people that's affordable. But I don't think SB in its current form is going to do that very effectively. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, Aaron, please.
Hi, my name's Aaron Priven. I live on Stanage near Solano, right in one of those circles. As we all know, the housing crisis is really acute here in California. I'm glad to see that Albany has taken some baby steps forward today with the Saha grant and the San Pablo grants. But we know that every city in California is not going to step up to do that. And we know that too many cities have added acre upon acre of low-density office parks without doing anything to help accommodate the people who need to live there. Need to work there. I lived in Santa Clara County for a few years in the 1990s, and even then it was difficult to find housing the middle class could afford. Now I've had decades where cities have attracted jobs but not made space for the people who would take those jobs. We talked a lot about how this is going to affect Albany, but it's going to affect every city in California, and Albany is just one part of the Bay Area-wide housing market. Cities like Cupertino and Santa Clara and Sunnyvale and Mountain View have pushed their housing demand out into the region. And we are, several steps out, but we're part of that. And if we don't take that perspective in mind, we're not doing this right. We have a choice. We can side with those who are trying to solve this problem or those who caused it. And the people who caused it are the people who come to meetings and complain that the terracotta is the wrong color of orange, and don't, to these standards that are not objective. And all these public comments have created, and all of that has created the problem we're in. It's not the only thing, but it's part of it. The legislative analysts showed that if you look at their reports, market rate housing is not as effective as affordable housing in creating affordability, but it does do some good. And it costs a lot less because we don't have to pay for it out of our budgets. Albany shouldn't side with the cities that cause the problems, the cities whose interests are represented in the League of Cities letter that you received today. Albany should be part of the solution, and passing SB 50 is part of that by allowing new housing in job-rich and transit-oriented communities. If you do write to the legislature, please show your support for solving California's problems. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think we need to pass the mic again down to the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. My vision is shot, part of my condition. I need surgery coming up. I have not been able to read this, but I appreciate the presentation. Excellent. I'm concerned about the time and the energy, the expense of building this great big thing at Cleveland and Washington, and I'm not saying we shouldn't do it. I think we should. But I also think we should find a way to find at least 60 people in Albany who are willing to put an ADU in their backyard, and that might go a lot faster, a lot less infrastructure, a lot less fuss and permits and all that stuff. And those should be affordable. There should be incentives for those people who provide that kind of situation. say you put 100,000 into one of those things, that comes to, unless my math is totally off, like $6 million to build 60 units in backyards. Unless my math is wrong, I'm an artist, not a mathematician. That's a lot less than the 45 million to build the 60 units. Again, I support that. But I also think the time's coming we're going to need all those ADUs also, and I don't know all the ins and outs of these changes with the ADUs and these housing element things. I've been out of the loop for a while. So I hate living in a Saha building. It sucks. When I was in the hospital, they provided me an eviction notice. Aren't they wonderful? I want to live in a little granny unit someplace with character and charm in a neighborhood where I can feel a part of a community instead of just a big block. I think there are people like me that don't want to live in a big box, people like me who would like to live in a neighborhood. So I'm hoping that this kind of project, as it supports AB 50, we definitely have a problem. It's going to get worse, but I think all options should be looked at. All of them should be engaged, and we should get those 60 people in our town to make 60 ADUs, give them incentives, find those people, and add that to the mix of the 60 units that we're putting in down next to the freeway. I live on Shattuck. The noise there is deafening. I don't know about the noise next to the freeway. But in terms of supporting the 50, the AB 50, I will support whatever it takes to provide housing for those of us who are too poor, too disabled, too old, too sick, whatever it is, to deal with housing in a mainstream, expensive market rate manner. I want to see that people like myself are included in this. We need more affordable units, ADUs. If it's, what did you say, like if it's less than a certain amount of units, the affordability factor goes away? That's bogus. All of them should be affordable. We should provide incentives to the landlords so they will do that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Any other members of the public? Going once, going twice? Okay, let's bring it back to the council. Oh, and by the way, Jeff, if you could provide the electronic copy of your presentation, that would be great. In fact, ACTC, I believe, what they do is for all the presentations, all the PowerPoints, for example, they post those after the meetings because they understand that sometimes people are working on those up until meeting time, but then they do post them for the public afterwards. Okay, back to council. Let's start with Councilmember Moss, if that's okay.
Sure. Well, my main comments are, essentially, this is still very much a work in progress. I mean, we're just talking about something that's in the Senate right now. It still has to go to the Assembly. It still has to work its way between the two houses, and then it's not clear that Newsom will sign it. So this is very kind of distant in my mind, and I think it'll get a very different reception in the Assembly, and there'll be a lot of changes on this bill. As it is now, my sense is that, as I think you pointed out, a lot of it doesn't probably apply to Albany. I think that the comment that was made that a lot of the housing problems that we have in the greater Bay Area, I think are due to the job growth and the population growth that we had here, sort of put on by Silicon Valley and about the whole high-tech industry, which has kind of pushed out everybody into all the surrounding communities. It's those communities, the Santa Claras of the world, that need to have been building housing. This is, to my sense, this is Sacramento's attempt to fix it. It's not a perfect bill. I don't think it's a perfect bill. And there's all these questions that you've mentioned in terms of what does a job-rich environment mean. I can get into minutia of questions that I have about, how far from a transit center, how do you determine what the center of a transit center is? So this is all going to have to be worked out by Housing and Community Development as if this thing in fact does pass. But it is an attempt to address the housing issue. Does it produce as much affordable housing or low-income housing as some people would like? I doubt it. But I think that we also have to recognize that there's probably not enough money in the state or that the state is going to spend to produce the amount of affordable housing that would be desirable if we could do it. So in some ways, we are tied to the private developers, and what that magic number is, 15%, 20%, 25%, whatever. If a developer isn't going to make money from a project, they're not going to do the project, in which case we don't get any. We get 0% of affordable housing. Now, there are, obviously, Saha is one of the exceptions to that rule, but that is a nonprofit agency doing it. In terms of the bigger picture, I think tonight we're sort of expected to either sign on to the League of California Cities position that says we don't like this bill, here's all these things you have to change. I'm still of a mind that I don't think we should sign anything tonight. I wouldn't vote for any kind of criticism until we actually see what's coming down the pike. And I think we're a ways away from that. I might have other comments, but that's what comes to mind right now.
Okay, sounds good. Vice Mayor?
What is the timeline on this? Is it going to some committee this week? Was that what I remembered from last time?
The latest news is that Senate Pro Tem Atkins pulled it out of the Appropriations Committee on Friday and sent it to the Rules Committee to be reassigned to another committee. And I gather from that she was trying to support the legislation. It was not well received by the chair of the Appropriations Committee. So I don't know that, at least from the official schedule, there's no indication of what committee it's going to or when it would be going. But it has to get out of the Senate by January 31st.
Okay. I mean, everybody, I think, believes that we need more housing. I just feel like there's a lot of flaws in this, a lot of things that don't seem to me to be as well thought out as I'd like. I kind of agree with you that maybe we don't do anything right now. I don't like saying, yeah, this bill is fine, because we know it's not, and it's got some serious flaws. But I'm wondering if just sort of sitting back and watching is not best.
Okay. Councilmember Nason?
Yeah. Although I do agree that there's a lot still to be worked through here, I would like to see Albany go on record as favoring this version of SB 50 in concept. It's a struggle for me. I've spent my adult life in the conservation movement and have always believed in population stabilization at the local, national, and global levels as a very important goal. But the reality is we do have a growing population for very good reason. We have immigrants continue to wish to come and should be allowed to come. We have young people moving into the area to seek jobs. And as much, I certainly see the tension between our duty as elected officials and as citizens to make our little part of the world as good as it can be. But I think we also have a moral obligation to our young people and to people who are entering the area to share the good things that we have and to move over and make room for them. So despite concerns about the details, I have a great deal of faith in our Senator Nancy Skinner, our Assemblywoman Buffy Wicks, that I think that they will do a good job on this. I think they will listen to us about changes, concerns, changes, and so forth if we decide to engage. But I think that this really is the way for us to declare our support for housing. And for whatever impact it will have on Albany, I think it's also really important to realize that statewide, there are so many places that really don't want to make room, that are really happy with the way things are, don't want to necessarily make more housing available, and that contributes to a terrible polarization. And finally, I wanted to say this, and I have tremendous concern about what do we do for the poor? What do we do for people who really are not going to be able to afford housing, who can't afford the cost of the construction of housing, can't afford even very deeply aging and deteriorating housing? Terrible things happen when there isn't anywhere for poor people to live. But the people that in some ways I worry about even more as I look in the long term and the future is young people who cannot live, who find themselves with these extraordinary, hideous commutes and so forth. You know, the 40-hour week was one of the most fundamental labor protections ever adopted. By refusing to allow people, refusing to make room for people, we are imposing on people these commutes for which they're not paid. They pay for them. And it's essentially taking away from our workers what was provided as their right 100 years ago. And so I feel very strongly that we need to build homes that are affordable to working people. Those homes are going to be advertised as luxury. That doesn't bother me. I think they're called luxury housing because they have lovely finishes. You know, they'll have sub-zero appliances and nice countertops, but they're still, you know, condos next to the freeway. The real luxuries are a yard and the privacy of setbacks from your neighbors, and the ability to garden and do lots of things with your house. Those are the luxuries that people enjoy. Simply housing. We're just talking about building places where working people who have to support themselves and their families can live without doing crazy commutes and all the other terrible effects of what has happened with housing over the years. So despite a lifetime of conviction about the importance of as much conservation as we can achieve and as much population stabilization as we can achieve, I think we have to do this. I'd like to see Albany go on record favoring SB 50.
Thank you. Councilmember Barnes.
Sorry, why don't I just briefly go over my little packages that I gave you. I just pulled out 4 recent articles. One is about, the first one is about Scott Wiener and how much money he gets from the real estate industry. The second one addresses the issue of this 3.5 million housing crisis and the shortage of 3.5 million units that's been floating around. Dan Walters kind of takes that number apart. Dan Walters is a longtime government analyst who works for Cal Matters. The third one is pretty interesting. It's a longer, but this is from a housing commissioner in Minneapolis who, in Minneapolis, they basically got rid of R1 housing, and you are allowed to have triplexes by right in residential neighborhoods. And she is extremely critical of that. And as someone who is both an architect, is on her planning commission, and lives in a low-income neighborhood, because as we've seen in the Bay Area, it is low-income neighborhoods of color that she thinks will be most harmed by this type of sort of blunt instrument of upzoning. And then finally, the last letter is one from the city of Roanoke Park, which got published last year, but I liked it so much that I still use it because more than anything else I've seen, it really lists the constraints in building housing from the perspective of, in this case, a city in Sonoma. And I think the issue really is not what cities do. Cities are conceivably impose constraints, but most of the constraints are actually on the construction side because it's very expensive to build anything at all. I don't like SB 50. I've been following this bill since it was SB 827 2 years ago. I've been to the committee hearings. I think the shortest way to say it is back in the 80s, we had supply-side economics, which was part of the Reaganomics package, which even a mainstream Republican conservative, George H.W. Bush, referred to as voodoo economics. I think SB 50 is just rehashed and warmed over supply-side economics applied to the housing market. You're never going to solve the housing jobs imbalance, which is a real problem, because we need to talk about the demand side. And interestingly, there is an initiative in San Francisco that does that, ties the permitting of new office buildings to the development of affordable housing. That's sponsored by a community organization called TODCO. It's going to be on the ballot in March. And I think it's a big mistake not to look at, as someone who was trained as an economist, you got to look at both the demand and the supply side of the market, and just building more housing isn't going to improve the jobs housing balance or reduce prices unless we think about what's going on the demand side and why there is so much demand for housing. I also think that there's a lot to be said for moving jobs to where housing is. And that would be, well, it's happening whether we like it or not, because the adjustment is happening. It's happening in Sacramento. It's happening in Riverside County. But I think more explicit policies to do that, to move jobs to Oakland or Walnut Creek or Concord, would also be a good idea. Brookings, by the way, the big liberal think tank in D.C., is now proposing that we actually have explicit federal policies to try to develop tech centers somewhere else because of the negative externalities of the pressure on coastal cities is getting so bad that it makes a lot more sense to try to develop tech clusters somewhere else, like in the Midwest. But bringing it home to Albany, here's my final question for Jeff. Does SB 50 allow us to do anything that we couldn't do on our own if we maintained local control? We could raise height limits.
You could amend the zoning ordinance to mimic the parameters that they have in this legislation.
Yeah, so for us, clearly, we gain nothing by letting go of our local control. Since my job
Sorry,
here,
I couldn't hear. We gain nothing by
letting go of local control. This is a bill that takes away local control and shifts it towards the corporate real estate industry. And the enemy is us. The enemy is people like us, because we represent our little towns and our neighborhoods and our communities, and we're in their way. However, I think what we do is important. I think democracy needs to be local if it means anything at all. So I am a firm advocate in maintaining local control. The League of California Cities is also. This town gains nothing from SB 50, and it gives up local control. Other places, I agree with the gentleman who spoke. I read the East Bay Times mostly so I can keep up with local real estate stuff. And what's going on in the San Jose area with the buying and developing of office projects strikes me as being insane, because they must realize when they buy and plan these new office projects that there's no place for the workers to live who are going to occupy those buildings. And however, I'm pretty sure SB 50 is not going to solve that problem either, because Mayor Sam Liccardo is best friends with Carl Guardino, who's the head of the Silicon Valley Leadership Group. And I know this because he was in a bike accident. It was reported in the San Jose Mercury News, and his bike buddy, Liccardo's bike buddy, was Sam Guardino, and he's the one who helped get him back into the hospital. And now I'm grateful as a cyclist he had a bike buddy with him. That's why you ride with other people. But I'm wondering if his other constituents have that kind of access to him. But anyway, just to summarize that argument, there's a lot going on with incredibly rapid growth in the South Bay. And I don't think SB 50 is going to really address the root problem, which is this dramatic growth by tech industries, which are poorly regulated, and by the amount of venture capital that is getting dumped into the region, which, by the way, isn't going to last forever. When I look at what Jeff told us, most of the same points are reiterated in the draft letter I have here of the League of California Cities letter. In fact, just going through it, there's no really point in going through it because Jeff covered most of these elements already.
I'm sorry, what are you looking at right now?
This is, well, you can see it. That's the draft of that's the League of California's suggested letter. It basically walks through the same points that Jeff walked through. Clarification, and maybe Mala can step in here. This bill's got to clear this. This is a 2-year bill. Remember, Portantino and Appropriations made this a 2-year bill at the end of last year. So it's on a very constricted timeline this year because when it comes back. So it's got to clear the Senate and move to the Assembly by the 31st. And how long does the Assembly have to deal with it? Okay, but the reality is Skinner and Wicks are not going to be having any time. This bill is, they've greased the skids. They're ramming this bill down our throats. Any objections we have are going to be irrelevant because they will not have time to make any serious amendments to this bill. It's on too fast a timeline. And some of the objections, for example, one objection that the League of California Cities bill makes, which has been a problem ever since SB 827 2 years ago that Jeff didn't mention, is that changes in zoning rules, if you tie them to transit routes, your transit organization, which is not responsible to us or out, becomes a de facto zoning agency, because if they increase the frequency of their bus routes, the zoning changes. And I remember talking to a person I know, all these local agency planners all live in Albany, so you bump into them. And I remember talking to someone from a local transportation agency and saying, how do you feel about becoming a zoning agency? And they were like, you know, they didn't want to go there.
Do you think we can wrap it up?
Can I see the letter back?
It's right here.
Oh, you give it back?
Brought it back to you.
So my feeling is I would like to have Jeff draft something that's consistent with his presentation, which is very consistent with the League of California Cities letter that objects to SB 50. SB 50 is a train wreck. It's been a train wreck since it was at SB 827, and I think we have done better, as a matter of fact. SB 5 was a much better bill. It got vetoed by the governor. It provided money for affordable housing, which SB 50 does next to nothing for affordable housing. Affordable housing is where the need is critical. And I think this SB 50 is not going to be the last word. If this bill is defeated, there'll be many, many other bills coming down the pike over the years, and they would be a better start for solving our housing problems.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate your passion on that. So from what I can see, we have one vote for Jeff to write an opposed letter, a couple of votes for do nothing, one vote to write an...
I think we have thoughts. I don't think we have votes.
Sorry. Sure, however you want to put it.
Yeah, and
So we seem to be of divided mind, and let me just say a few words.
Why don't you go ahead?
And one of the words would be, I'd like to just wrap this up as quickly as possible. From what I can hear, this isn't going to affect Albany very much. So I don't think, what we do is going to be more symbolic towards the region, but maybe we ought to think about, if it's not affecting Albany, let's not spend too much time on this. I'm not in favor of having staff spend time drafting a letter either, for the same reasons. I appreciate this legislation in that it's moving the ball forward. It recognizes some of the problems that Councilmember Nason brought up and others have brought up, that housing is not being built by some communities. They've got their built-out community, they've got their single-family homes or whatever, and they say, okay, we're fine. We don't need to build any more housing. We don't want to absorb those people because we like things how they are. I don't agree with that sentiment. I think that every city should be absorbing the need and building the dense and I feel green housing that's needed. And anyone who's pushing building is going to get donations from the real estate industry, fortunately or unfortunately, maybe. Certainly well, anyway, moving beyond that. So I appreciate Mr. or Senator Wiener moving the ball forward and trying to get something done. And I actually was little bit concerned with some of what I saw the flaws in this in the legislation from the presentation today. Some of them I hadn't seen before, so I would definitely agree that it's certainly not a perfect bill. I think at this, and just very quickly, I think I want affordable housing to be built. I think I want market rate housing to be built. Market rate is a little bit easier. And affordable housing can be very difficult and very expensive to build, but I don't think but market rate housing is shown to cause displacement as well. So it's a complicated equation there. I'm a little bit concerned that this mostly addresses market rate housing. I would probably be in favor of doing nothing at this point, or if one of the council members were to be interested in drafting a letter to examine that at another council meeting. So that's my take at this point.
Could I say something? When I said I'm not sure we need to go after this bill, especially at this point, but I do like what Councilmember Nason said about and what you were saying about the spirit of the bill. This is not a perfect bill, but perhaps we could draft a letter saying we like the spirit of the bill. We think that there are things that are going to have to be worked out in terms of the way it works with housing elements, with defining some of the terms, et cetera. But basically, the idea that the state needs to kind of light a firecracker under some cities to get them to start the housing process, which is what I think this bill is the intention is I don't think is so bad.
The Vice Mayor is recognized.
Thank you. Could we go with the league? We have a template that the league has sent with the thoughts that they have, which seem to be sort of where our concerns are, and it sort of followed along with, I think, primarily with what Jeff was saying. Could we use that template as our letter?
I'm a little uncomfortable with some of the league things because I think their natural intention is to always protect cities and city rights, and I get that to a degree, but we're at a really big problem about housing, particularly in some parts of California. And particularly in the Bay Area, and I'd rather tone that down, make some vague references to some of these things, but basically also say that we think that yes, the state needs to start doing some mandates in order to get this ball rolling.
Okay, Councilmember Nason, I think you had a few things to say.
Yeah, I'd like to stay away. As I look at the template of the League of Cities, there's a lot of detail here about, and some of these issues seem valid to me, some do not. I don't think that there is such a thing as a perfect housing bill or a perfect suite of bills. And affordable housing, it's not affordable housing, it's subsidized housing, and it's immensely expensive. And we have to be looking for ways to provide for people in ways that are acceptable and comfortable. I very much agree with Ms. Burrell about ADUs for seniors in particular. But there isn't going to be a perfect bill. What I would love to see us do is say thank you to the sponsors of the bill. We in Albany agree that it is crucial for every city in California to take responsibility for a share of the housing problem and to seek solutions. The local flexibility, to my mind, is an enormous, and I did oppose this bill previously, but to me, the local flexibility is the right direction. I would mention that that is the right direction, and I would include a statement. We share many of the concerns that have been expressed by others, including the League of Cities. However, we do believe it is time for the state to move forward with policies that will reduce the restrictive burden on housing, as SB 50 does.
I think I could support the sentiments of Councilmember Nason and Councilmember Moss. I'm going to suggest that perhaps what we could do is, if you two are willing to go off and draft a letter to bring back to the council, maybe that's the way forward. And I think hearing what you've said, I probably could support what you do.
Okay. Do we need to do some kind of
A formal motion of that?
formal motion for that? We should.
Oh, okay. Would either of you like to come up with a motion?
Timing-wise, we're not going to be able, if we need to write a letter, bring it back to the council and get a vote on it, we'll miss whatever is the next deadline. But I'm going on the assumption that this is not going to be over on the 31st, that's not what anybody expects. So we could do something and bring it back to the next council meeting.
Okay. Would you like to make a formal motion?
The League of California's cities position is oppose unless amended. So they're not outright opposed to the bill, but there are some issues that they would like to see amended. And it's conceivable, although I doubt it, that they would change their stance. But the league, as it stands right now, is working to get some, changes to the bill. So that might evolve as well. That's just a consideration.
I guess we're saying that our position would be support the bill and support amendments without necessarily even specifying which amendments. Simply, we agree with many of the concerns. Nobody in Sacramento is sitting up there saying, I wonder what Albany thinks. It's just that we would be adding our voice to the general, what has become, I think, a consensus of a lot of thoughtful people that we need, is that something needs to be done. And I'm not hearing Michael, Councilmember Barnes, disagreeing with that. It would be support and support potential amendments.
So perhaps a resolution just to authorize the two of you to draft a letter for a future council agenda. Would that be appropriate?
Yeah.
Okay, would you, one of you like to make that motion?
I'll give it a shot. I'd like to move that Councilmember Nason and myself form a subcommittee to draft a letter indicating our general support for SB 50 and the attempts by Scott Wiener and some of the other state officers who are trying to address the housing issue. And,
That's good enough, I think.
is that,
Yeah. Second? Do you want a second? Or?
I will second that.
Okay. Would you do a roll call, please?
Councilmember Barnes?
No.
Councilmember Moss?
yes.
Councilmember Nason?
Yes.
Vice Mayor McQuaid?
Yes.
Mayor Pilch?
Yes. And the motion carries. And we thank you for being willing to draft that letter. All right, moving on to the next agenda item, and thank you for those who came out to speak. Next agenda item is item 10, public hearing, which there is none, so we will move along to agenda item 11. 11.1, under unfinished business, is the intent to amend the planning criteria associated with San Pablo Solano mixed-use neighborhood priority development area, and I'm sure that staff has a presentation or some words for us.
Just a brief verbal staff report. This is an agenda item that you've discussed a couple of times last year, and this is just bringing to a close the current phase. So I won't go into a lot of details, but happy to answer any questions. In June of 2019, the Association of Bay Area Governments and the Metropolitan Transportation Commission revised their Planned Development Area Program Criteria. PDA is the acronym that's commonly used. And based on the new criteria, Albany's current PDA, while it still meets transit criteria, no longer meets the planning criteria. And ABAG has requested that cities indicate an intent to amend our PDAs to bring it into compliance with the new criteria. And in particular, the new criteria need to require that cities begin the process of general plan and zoning ordinance amendments and California Environmental Quality Act review to allow for housing and employment growth at transit-supportive densities is the term that they use. So in 2019, in September 2019, the ABAG requested letters from city staff. Council discussed this and authorized staff to use our judgment in submitting that letter of intent. And what we said then and want to continue to believe is important is for the council to document your support for a future amendment to the PDA. This is an amendment that's a few years off. We don't know what the details will be. And in fact, we think ultimately it will be the final step in a series of things that are happening already. The action you took earlier tonight with spending the SB2 grant on doing some planning for San Pablo Avenue is a big step. The work that you'll be doing in 2021 and 2022 on a housing element will be a big step. And then we'll amend the PDA to reflect those changes that you'll be working on in the near term. So again, this is a request for approval of a resolution that just documents the council's support of the letter of intent to ABAG. It's a non-binding commitment, but it does make clear that so for a future city council, when they're looking at the history of this, they can see that you were behind the initial steps.
Thank you, Jeff. Yes, any questions from council? Let's start with Vice Mayor McQuaid. Councilmember Nason, Councilmember Barnes.
This is the same process we've discussed before, correct? It's just continuing.
Okay. Councilmember Moss. Questions?
I think the only question I had, this is really just the very beginning of this whole process. You wouldn't really get going on this until 2021 or?
For the PDA itself, I don't think we'll start working on it until 2023 or 2024. The deadline is 2025.
For this letter of intent?
The letter of intent just says that a future council should consider amending the PDA.
Okay. So hopefully this gets discussed in the next election for council because it's something they're going to be dealing with, not at least three of us on this end of the dais.
Right.
Okay.
I have a couple of questions. One is, would it be fair to say that the downside of doing this is that we have to do the work to amend the PDAs, so staff time, but the upside is potentially more eligibility for grant opportunities?
Yes, you're correct. I believe, although I can't anticipate exactly what future grant opportunities will require. In many cases, they're using PDAs as a tool to prioritize where grant funds are awarded.
Mm-hmm. They certainly have done that in the past, yeah. Oh, and shoot, I thought I had another question. Darn it. Oh, yes. I think in the staff report, this one or maybe a previous one, it's noted that Berkeley decided either, maybe you can explain it, did they withdraw their PDA or decide not to redo their PDA for San Pablo Avenue?
I don't know what their plans are for San Pablo Avenue. The question that council had was...
Oh, was it Solano? Solano, okay, I see.
Our PDA includes Solano, and that decision was made at the time because of a acreage requirement. We were cobbling together enough area. At council's request, I did contact the director of community development in Berkeley, and he got back to me promptly and said that no, they don't have plans to add their segment of Solano Avenue to any sort of PDA planning process at this time.
I see. So then we wouldn't be redoing our PDA for Solano either, or?
No, ours is connected. Ours is San Pablo and Solano are connected. It's one.
Just one.
It's one area.
Oh, and it's one area, but does it cross the jurisdictions into Berkeley? No. No, they just count the Albany portion.
And
I see.
It remains a concern because that means that we do have this stretch in which it is Berkeley, a fairly long stretch of Solano Avenue is Berkeley on one side and Albany on the other side.
That's true.
So one side will be a PDA and the other side will not be a PDA, even though, you know, there are places on the Berkeley side that might be worthy of consideration for additional housing. I think we should continue to pursue the idea of a more coordinated planning approach with Berkeley.
Yeah, that sounds good, but the question would be, did they give you any reason why they weren't pursuing, or just said they weren't pursuing?
They didn't.
Okay. It would be worth knowing, I think.
Well, they have, 3 or 4 different PDAs in Berkeley as it is. If you look in that last document that we have in our, they have San Pablo, they have Adeline, they have Shattuck, and I think one other. So they have a bunch of areas already that
okay.
And they're all
going to be part of that area.
They tend to be low-income areas, and there's probably considerable resistance to having Upper Solano Avenue, I'm just guessing, become a PDA.
Okay, well, we're kind of devolving or evolving into comments, so let's pause and see if there's any public who would like to make a comment. And seeing one, please come to the podium. Thank you.
Thanks, Aaron Priven. I'm going to be brief. I support this. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your comments. So, yeah, I think you probably are right for the reasons they don't want to pursue the PDA, although I'd like to hear it from staff. If you have an opportunity to talk to staff about that, that'd be great. Well, we can also ask our electeds how they, in Berkeley, our corresponding electeds, how they feel about that. I'm very interested in still having coordinating that, and maybe at least just joining that section of Solano where there's Berkeley on one side with our PDA. But Councilmember Moss.
You know, looking at this, I don't know what the document's called, but they have 6 different areas listed as PDAs. So even though Berkeley's much larger than we are, they might have some issues around staff time too if they add yet another one to develop.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it'd be good to get it from the horse's mouth about why, exactly. Is there any other, I think I support this because of the possibility of grant funding, and the timeline seems reasonable given other staff priorities. So any other comments from council members? Okay. Would someone like to move this item?
I'll move we adopt Resolution 2020-09.
I'll second.
We have a motion and a second. Roll call, please.
Councilmember Barnes?
Yes.
Councilmember Moss?
Yes.
Councilmember Nason?
Yes.
Vice Mayor McQuaid?
Yes.
And Mayor Pilch?
Yes.
The motion carries.
Okay, thank you. And we move on then to item 11.2, approval of the symbolic lighting display policy, illuminating the tower at Albany Community Center. We have two resolutions, a lighting display policy and a lighting schedule. Is there any staff report?
Good evening, council. So during the council meeting last November, the council authorized the use of up to $6,500 from the city council discretionary fund to develop a lighting program to illuminate the tower at the Albany Community Center to recognize certain local events, national events, or significant events. So staff has prepared the symbolic lighting display policy and the lighting schedule for 2020 for your review and approval.
Okay, thank you. Are there questions for staff? Vice Mayor McQuaid. Councilmember Nason.
Yeah, how are we going to communicate to people what this lighting is for? If it's up and if there's this lighting going on and, how are people going to know that it's, police?
Signage or something, or?
What?
Well, we always have e-news and there's e-notifications. That can be, since we have the lighting schedule, that can be sent out in advance.
Okay.
If that's what the council desires.
Further questions, Councilmember Barnes, Moss?
I was just curious how you came up with the events for 2020. How was that? How were those chosen?
So I started with a long list. I took City of San Francisco's list, which had a lot of events that didn't pertain to Albany. Went down to some of the proclamation that we recognized and stuff like that. It was still close to two pages long. And right now we thought, because we're just starting on this program, we should start small. So I chose some of the events that affect us locally, like for example, the local week, the Albany Film Fest, United Against Hate Week. That's something we always recognize, and National Police Week, and the Fire Prevention Week. And of course, we have the Pride Month. So we're just starting with a few to see how it goes, and we can modify this as we go. And also, we have to, we don't have the lighting installed and set up yet, so starting small to see how the lights will work.
And we certainly could make additions or deletions here tonight if we wanted as well.
Are we passing tonight what the events will be for 2020, and then next year there'd be a separate?
Yes. So at the last meeting, the council had mentioned every December we would have a resolution to approve the following year's events.
But if we've forgotten one, certainly we can amend the schedule during the year if we feel it's necessary.
Has anyone made any comments about what our carbon footprint is now that we're using all this energy for lighting?
We're dark for Earth Hour, but we're lit for Earth Day. Maybe if we did it the other way around.
Well, I'm assuming it's going to be
save a little
LED
energy.
lighting, which is pretty low impact, but perhaps we could call for a solar panel to power, solar panel and a battery.
That's a great idea.
To light it, something to shoot for anyway. There's no more members of the public, so I don't have to worry about that. So my question was, so you are suggesting that we, for a one-day event, we light it on that day, but if it's a week-long or a month-long event, we only light it for one day as well, choosing Wednesday as the lighting day.
Yeah, I chose Wednesday because it's the middle of the week, and also in case if we need to have a proclamation done for a council meeting or something to recognize the event, there's still time to do it Monday and light it for Wednesday. There are 2 events which I put in there for a week long, which is the Albany Film Fest and Albany Local Week.
And did you say that you looked at what San Francisco did? Was that it?
Yeah, that was the very, very first draft.
Because they light their city hall?
Exactly.
Okay, all right.
And Coit Tower.
Ah, okay. Oh, I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah,
Okay.
big SF on it right now for football.
Oh, okay. I guess, well, I'm sorry, I shouldn't go in front of my council members. Any other comments about this item?
Yeah, I voted against this, and I still don't support it, and I'd like to make note of that. I think it's just, it's one of those things about being a little tiny city. I don't think we should take these things on, and I see a lot of potential for, if Italians want Columbus Day and Native Americans want Indigenous Peoples Day, and, what do we do with that? I'd rather we didn't go there at all. If we are going to go there, I would say we should include, at a minimum, Women's Equality Day and particularly Emancipation Day as days that are, if we're honoring LGBTQ, et cetera, I think that those 2 monuments, especially Emancipation Day, ought to be considered. But I'm going to probably vote no anyway, so just wanted to make that comment.
I do have a comment. I think
Councilmember.
we already went there. We
Yes.
adopted a flag policy that allowed us more flexibility to have more political displays on our flagpole at City Hall. So I think it's, as Pete sometimes says, I think that cart has already left the barn, or whatever the saying is. So I don't see that. I don't have strong feelings about this one way or the other, but I don't see that as an objection. Okay.
Well, I do want to note, I just remembered, we do have greenhouse gas-free electricity through EBCE, so perhaps the carbon footprint, although it is more energy, perhaps the carbon footprint, we don't have to worry about that so much. I would support adding the Women's Equality Day. I'm a little bit unfamiliar with Emancipation Day. Is that
It's
commemorating?
often called Juneteenth.
Oh, okay.
It's the 16th of June, the day that the Emancipation Proclamation was issued.
I could support those. I also would think that the e-news is great to advertise this and city council meetings, but perhaps if it's going to be at the community center, I would think some signage would be appropriate as well, maybe on the front and the back, so that people can immediately know why it's being lit. What do my council members think?
I'm also not a fan of signage, but since we do signs on the community center, it makes sense. But again, my main concern is just the distraction and staff time, and turning this into something that ends up being a matter of discussion and concern when we have so many things to get done. But
Well,
if people want signs, putting signs in front of the community center makes sense to me.
is my understanding correct that we had some staff that were interested in doing this, or Vice Mayor, did you work with staff who was interested in this, or were they neutral? I think this is your idea originally that you brought to us.
It was my idea. I don't want to speak for staff. There was not opposition from any of the staff. Nobody ran screaming down the hall or anything. Yeah, I would say that it was well received. And before I look it up, are you thinking International Women's Day, which is May something? Is that what you're thinking? I think we need to add it in here.
So Women's Equality Day is August 26th.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I think it's different
Right,
than
it's
the
the day they got the
international.
voting rights.
Day that women, yeah.
That was Joey's birthday.
Okay. Not International Women's Day then.
Okay, well, that's
Okay.
fine.
Also a great day, but not what you were referring to. Okay, well, would someone like to make a motion, maybe with a few amendments here?
I can find it. I'll move that we adopt Resolution 2020-07 and 2020-08 with the inclusion of June 16th and August 26th.
June 19th.
Is it 19 or 16? I thought you said-
Emancipation Day 2020 is June 19th, Friday.
19th, okay,
Okay.
that's right.
I'll second.
Okay, and
Councilmember,
go ahead.
Councilmember Barnes,
Yes.
Councilmember Moss,
Yes.
Councilmember Nason,
No.
Vice Mayor McQuaid,
Yes.
Mayor Pilch.
Yes,
The motion carries.
looking forward to a more colorful city. All right, so we have come to new business, of which there is none, item 12. Item 13, future agenda items. We still have yet to hear the agenda item for the repeal and replacement of Chapter 20.32 signs of the Albany Municipal Code. It's being continued to a date uncertain. That will appear in a future agenda. And Councilmember Nason, you had one?
Yeah, actually two.
Okay.
One is the discussion of the Cordonices Creek fence that has been put up across the trail connecting East Shore Highway with the transfer station. The other is I've sent the staff some financial questions, and maybe that will be responded to without necessarily a presentation, but they are Golden Gate Fields. What are the financial implications for Albany should Golden Gate Fields either stop horse racing and or be acquired by a public entity? What are the financial implications for the city? Another is the state auditor's report, which raised some red flags about Albany's pension funding, and that has been mentioned in discussions, and that we get more information on that. And there was another one, and it's not coming immediately to mind.
Well, you certainly are always free to send it to myself and or the city manager.
I sent it to the city manager. We don't think about the finances enough. We've got to talk about it. So they're all financial questions.
Oh, okay.
I'll send that out.
And the state auditor's report, is that the one you're referring to that marks El Cerrito, but it marks El Cerrito as red and
Yes.
Albany as yellow and other
Yeah.
cities around here as yellow? Okay.
Although Albany was red in like 3 categories, and that was what I was asking about.
Okay. Thank you for that.
And I think we also want these subcommittees reorganization.
Measure
Yeah.
M was your third.
Thank you.
Pardon?
Measure M was your third.
Oh, Measure M, yeah, I wanted to get some reporting on, because we did pass Measure M, and I think that we've got a year of collections, and I'd like us to be able to demonstrate to the public that that is going to its intended purposes. That was our park maintenance measure.
Okay. Very good. Thank you for those. Any other future agenda items?
Can I just ask a question? I've seen the fence. I know what you're referring to. Is that better handled at the staff level, or is there a role for us in that?
It came to the council for review of a possible encroachment permit, so I think it's likely headed back to the council, given that the fence is up. Staff is happy, obviously, to do the background work to prepare what our options are at this point, and
It came to the
Direction.
council?
Yeah, I believe you brought it to council.
Oh, but not, I thought you meant that an encroachment permit had been
it wasn't approved. It was pulled from the agenda.
pulled. Yeah, okay.
Okay, thank you. Any other future agenda items? If not, in our agenda is announcements of upcoming city meetings and events. Traffic and safety and planning and zoning is coming up. And our next meeting, do we know the date of that? It's
February 3rd.
February 3rd? Okay. And if there are no other items, seeing none, I will adjourn the meeting. Thank you.